Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I replaced the exhaust flex pipe on a 2014 Kia Rio.
To begin, I drove up the front of the vehicle on 2 car ramps. Next, I put the transmission shifter in park position and I engaged the parking brake. Then, to improve safety, I placed a wheel chuck behind each of the 4 wheels. To avoid the electrical problems, I disconnected and isolated the negative battery terminal. Here, you can see some exhaust components like the resonator, the rear catalytic converter, and the flex pipe. The flex pipe is located just over the crossmember behind the engine. In theory, undoing the 4 nuts of the flex pipe and the oxygen sensor seems easy to do, but in reality it can be quite difficult to do. I checked the 4 nuts and they were more rusted than I thought. Using any kind of torches to loosen the rusted nuts was not safe enough for me, because I had to lay down on the ground to work under the vehicle. The 2 options I had in mind were to use a nut extractor or a cutting wheel to remove the nuts or the studs. At first glance, the braided wires around the flex pipe looked fine from underneath, but they were corroded and broken on the upper side. The braided wires were so damaged that I was able to pull them down and remove most of them with good safety glove. Many broken wires fell on the ground. It was hazardous, so I cleaned the mess without delay. Normally there's no need to cut the pipe, but I did it to gain more room to position my camera later on. I disconnected the exhaust hanger and then I used the bungee cord to keep the flexible pipe aside to cut it shorter. The nuts and the studs were so rusted out that I used a grinder with a cutting wheel to cut them out. The vibration and the heat caused by the cutting wheel loosened the studs from the rear flange. The size of the genuine studs was M12 and the thread pitch was 1.25 mm. Here you can see the original steel gasket. The other studs inserted in the flange of the manifold converter were also the same metric size. I found it more convenient to keep the front M12 studs functional and only replace the rusted nuts with new ones. Before undoing these nuts, it was safer to disconnect the plug of the oxygen sensor and unfasten the electrical harness. The harness plug is connected to the lower connector receptacle. This is the plastic fastener that holds the plug behind the bracket. When the plug was disconnected, I unfastened the harness. Soon after, I tried to undo the front nuts with an extractor and it didn't work. I have not been able to film and work at the same time, but I did cut the edge of the nuts with a small cutting wheel. Then I used an extractor to loosen them. At the end, I sprayed some penetrating fluid to undo them with my fingers. When I removed the front section of the flex pipe, I was careful not to hit the oxygen sensor on any metal part. I also removed the gasket to replace it with a new one. Here you can see that the ceramic core of the front catalytic converter was in good condition. Sometimes it can be very difficult to unscrew an oxygen sensor under the vehicle. So, if I can, I prefer to use a bench vise to hold the exhaust pipe. To easily undo an oxygen sensor, usually I use an oxygen sensor socket drive combined with a steel ring. Before reinstalling the oxygen sensor, I cleaned up the dirt and the fluid residues with a dry rag. The new flexible pipe was delivered with 2 gaskets, 4 washers, 4 grade 5 SAE bolts and 4 matching nuts. First, I checked if the oxygen sensor was fitting properly with the new part. And next, I checked the fittings of the gaskets on the 2 ends of the flex pipe. Usually, I apply copper anti-seize on the threads, but nickel anti-seize can be used. Depending on the brand of the oxygen sensor that I install, I always refer to the company specs to properly tighten it. Back under the vehicle, I plugged each open end of the two catalytic converters with lint-free towels. Then I cleaned the mating surfaces of the two flanges before fitting the new flex pipe. I bound these M12 by 1.25 mm nuts to fit with the OEM studs. To begin the pipe installation, I fitted the gasket with the two studs. After, I positioned the front of the flex pipe without holding the gasket. Next, I aligned the rear flanges and the second gasket together. I loosely fitted and tightened the bolts and the nuts that were included with the pipe kit. The front flange was properly positioned, so I fitted and loosely tightened the nuts by hand. Soon after, I torqued them down to specs. The new exhaust bracket was a bit short, but it was long enough to support the exhaust pipe. Not long after, I reconnected the harness plug and the receptacle. Then I inserted the fastener in the bracket hole to secure the parts in place. I also rerouted the harness with the clips. I reconnected the battery and I started the engine. I reinstalled the rest of the parts, and later I drove the car for about 10 minutes without any problem.
Depending on the state of the nuts, I made sure to have the proper tools to be able to complete the work without having too much problems.